So today we have our chief mechanic who knows everything about bikes, Greg Smith. Greg is here to talk to us about our brand new bike, the Yonder. We are so excited to introduce you to this bike. It's totally different than any other Zize bike we've done. And that's especially why we wanted Greg to talk to you about some of the components that he designed into this bike. So Greg, can we start by talking about the Q factor and explaining what it is? And this was the basis of how we started this bike.
Yeah, the Q factor is basically how far apart your feet are when you're pedaling. And on several of the other Zize bikes, people were ordering them with pedal extenders to move the pedals outside and make it wider. And a pedal extender is just a piece of metal that goes between the end of the pedal and the crank. And it's a one way to do this, but with modern bikes, they've come up with components that make it possible to make a stronger connection between the bike and the rider without having to use those extenders by making a component of the frame wider, which would be down there by the crank, the bottom bracket. That's where the bearings are that the pedals rotate on when you're pedaling. And due to downhill bikes and a couple other kind of bikes in other categories, there's now components available that make that narrower bottom bracket from the old racing days in France wider, so that our pedals do not have to have that extender in between the crank and the pedal, which would be much, much stronger the way that we're doing it now.
Exactly. And that's the thing. I mean, for our riders that aren't pushing really hard and they're going for cruises and they're doing a slower, more sedate ride, a pedal extender can be fine. It's a method to do it. But if you've got somebody who wants to ride more aggressively, it made me, and I know you, Greg, very nervous to have them putting all their weight and their energy into these tiny little pieces of steel.
Yeah, right. I mean, imagine if your customers imagine that the pedal would normally be right next to the crank arm. If you're putting something in between there, you're getting more of a lever between the pedal and the crank arm. We're taking that away and putting the width in the bottom bracket where you have a much bigger axle to take up that load.
Yeah, that's great. And that was what started this whole thing. Is Greg told me, well, they make bottom brackets that are wider. And I'm like, what?
Right. Yeah, and definitely. So it started there because we were looking for a really strong pedal extender.
Right.
Basically, again, it's a small piece of metal, and you can only make them so strong. Well, once we decided that the bottom bracket idea was a good one, because this is now, a typical bottom bracket is 68 millimeters. This is 100 millimeters, so it's significantly wider, and that necessitated a lot of other changes, but fortunately, those other changes also bring benefits with them, which we'll talk about in a little bit.
Yeah. So that's great. So you can see, you can't really see it. Greg pointed out where it is on the bike. It's really where the pedal actually turns. That's the crank.
Right over there. Oh, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So we can see a little better. We've kind of rigged up this unique Zoom based video. So Greg, can you show us where the bottom bracket, what it is that's wider?
Yeah, the bottom bracket is the part of the frame right here down by the pedals that holds the pedal axle or the pedal spindle that goes through the frame and connects both of the crank arms so that when you pedal, they move. And that part down there is what's wider. And that allows us not to have pedal extenders, but still have the pedals further outside the bike frame.
Perfect. And again, for Zize riders who are bigger and wider, usually, what happens is our natural positioning would have our feet coming wider apart than on a standard bicycle. So that's why we needed the wider Q factor. So
yeah, just imagine in the olden times when bike racers were racing, those are like skinny 130-pound people with very narrow bodies, and they made that for the mechanics to make them go as fast as possible. The mechanics on a more conventionally sized person or a larger person, they're really too narrow, and that's why this is really going to help.
Yeah. So that's the Q factor. Don't forget to come back later. We're going to talk about the other wonderful components of the Yonder. And thank you, Greg. It was really helpful.
Thank you. It's fun to work on this project.
Great.